Hello, my name's Jeff Peirce. I'm a local military history researcher and author. About 13 years ago, I decided to try and identify every man and woman from the southwest of WA who enlisted for service in the First World War. During this period, I'd recorded all of the names on the war memorials throughout the southwest of WA, and while I was doing the research, I was cross-checking to make sure that people I discovered that were local residents were actually on the local war memorial. So each new name I discovered, I compared to the records on the local war memorials, and in Dardanup's case, I found there were 8 soldiers I'd identified with a local address who were not on the memorial. And then local man Mike Hall contacted me and said, "Jeff, I found 2 more." So 2 years ago, we unveiled the new plaque on the memorial here with the 10 extra names, and I was very pleased to be part of that. During the research as well, I found a nurse, a First World War nurse, Elma Mary Linklater, who had her grave in the Bunbury Cemetery where I was working at the time. And when I reviewed her information, I found that she had been long-term living in Eton, in the Shire of Dardanup. So I felt I needed to review her entire service history, which is quite astounding. Now, Elma Linklater was born in Willockra in South Australia in 1879. She went and did her compulsory nursing training of 3 years at the Sydney Hospital, and after qualifying she went out into senior nursing at Maryborough in Queensland. While she was in Queensland, the matron she worked under was Grace Wilson, who ended up the matron-in-chief of the whole Australian Army Nursing Service, and wherever she was posted she took Elma Linklater with her. So the connection between the two was amazing. Elma's service all took place between, she was 4.5 years in the war, and her places of posting were extremely challenging, to say the least. Well, she enlisted on the 26th of April 1915, which was the day after the Anzac Dawn attack, and the boat took her to Plymouth first, because at this stage there were no hospitals or nurses anywhere near Gallipoli. The closest was over 1,000 kilometres away in Egypt. So the British decided with the early casualties, they really needed someone closer, because many men were dying on the ships on the way. So Elma was posted to Mudros, which is on the island of Lemnos, a Greek island, closer to Gallipoli than any other point. And she arrived there on the 9th of August 1915, and the British ship carrying all the stores was delayed. So they were there ready to treat the soldiers, and it took another 11 days before their stores arrived. So Elma spoke about 200 soldiers arriving on day 1, many seriously injured. A number were suffering from dysentery or paratyphoid, and they just had to lay them on the sand. There was nothing for them. The nurses also had to put up with no food, no water, no sanitation, no fresh fruit and veg, and also sleep deprivation was rife, because they could hardly just walk away and leave men in agony and to have a kip, when the first 11 days there was nothing to sleep in anyway. So this is what her first view of war service nursing was like. So Elma spent 5 months taking all the injuries and sicknesses from Gallipoli. After 4 days they had 800 men on the sand there. So once the evacuation of Gallipoli took place, towards the end of December 1915, the matron and the nursing staff were all transferred to the 3rd Australian General Hospital in Abbasia in Egypt, and there were huge numbers. And once again, actually Elma served for 8 months without one day off, which is totally against the rules and regulations that were laid out when they signed up. So I imagine once she left Egypt to go to England, she would have been totally exhausted. Following Elma's service in Egypt, she was posted to England and worked at the Lord Kitchener Hospital at Brighton in London, and huge numbers of patients again. I don't know how she was coping, but Matron Wilson was with her, and obviously they were the best of mates and probably helped each other through that period. Then they got the call. It was getting really serious on the Western Front at this stage. So the 3rd Australian General Hospital were relocated to a town called Abbeville in France. Now their hospital there was in huts and tents, and it was on top of a ridge, so they were getting huge winds coming through. And Elma spent more than 2 years at that location, and it was fairly primitive, but the surgical wards sometimes would run for 25 hours straight, and you can imagine they'd take time off to have a sleep, and then there'd be an urgent call again, because they spoke about the numbers of soldiers on stretchers outside the operating room, which was just a tent with wooden floor. So their workloads were just horrendous, to say the least. Now it was for her service at Abbeville that Elma was mentioned in dispatches by Sir Douglas Haig for her outstanding services. Once Elma left Abbeville, she had a bit of a long road before she finally came back to Australia towards the end of 1919, but she was able to get some leave and she did a little bit of touring. But when she arrived back in Australia, she went back to South Australia initially and went into private nursing. So she was a sought-after nurse because of her history. And not long after arriving back in Australia, she got notified of a second Royal Red Cross. She was actually given the Royal Red Cross medal prior to leaving England, and after her discharge she got a second one. And it was all to do with her devoted service, the length of her service, her character, and she was always happy. And that's the quotation on that second award. So she was one of our more decorated nurses. So then when the family called out for help, obviously she was only too willing to help, and she left an incredible legacy. She's also honoured. I developed a heritage walk within the Bunbury Cemetery, and Elma's grave is one of the stops, and we're currently looking at getting some funding to put an appropriate war service plaque on there, because that's not on the grave at the present. Elma was called to Eton by family because the lady of the house must have had some mental health issues. I'm not entirely privy to that, but she came as the family carer and housekeeper in the mid-1940s, and she did an incredible job. I've recently spoken to one of the girls who's now fairly elderly, but she told me what Elma was like within the household. Effectively, she was calm, she was never outspoken, and she had that house going like clockwork, and it was a pleasure for the two girls that she helped raise for 16 years, and they credit their success in life to Elma's influence. In the late 1940s, when she got that call out, that the family was in trouble here in Eton, she just came over, and she never went back to South Australia. She was devoted to the family, became ill later in life and died here in Bunbury. And her wish was, because of her strong connection to Bunbury, she left instructions to be buried here locally.
Amazing.
And one other interesting point about how families were so connected to the war service, she had a sister Bessie who also served with the Australian Army Nursing Service, and she never came to Western Australia. However, when she served in England, she ended up marrying a British soldier, and once nurses were married, they had to immediately resign. And tragically, she died during childbirth when she was 39 years of age. I guess the one positive out of the Linklater connection, besides Elma, was she had a brother James, who also served with distinction overseas, but he actually came back and was discharged and led a lengthy, quite an important life in South Australia. One of the girls said to me, the individual characteristics that Elma had dated back to the previous century. And she carried forward practices like in the backyard of the property in Eton, she kept goats to keep the grass down. So she kept these goats for some years, and certainly they did their job. The grass was fairly trimmed. But one evening, the billy decided that he would like a piece of Elma and charged her and knocked her down and injured her somewhat. So the man of the house, Mr. Butler, told her with some vigour that, Elma, that's the end of your goats. Now the second story was the girls used to come home from school, and at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, they'd look out in the backyard, and on the clothesline was a chook that has had its head cut off with its feet tied to the clothesline. And so she kept that practice going right until she left them. But they always had decent poultry for their roasts. So the lady who told me the most information and was in awe of Auntie Elma, as she called her, said that one day towards the end of her life, when she was ailing a little, this young lady said, "Oh, Aunt Elma, is there anything you haven't told us, or did you ever have a man in your life?" And she said, "Well, sadly, I had a man in my life at Mudross, but he went back and was killed on Gallipoli." Now, in searching the Australian War Memorial photographs of Matron Wilson and Nurse Linklater, I found a photograph of 5 or 6 people sitting on a picnic mat on Mudross, and it's labelled clearly, where there's a soldier sitting adjacent to Nurse Linklater with this romantic smile, if you like. And Nurse Linklater, in the only photo I've seen of her, had an obvious connection. So the young lady she helped raise, when I sent her the photo, she said, "There's something going on there." Now I think what would have happened, the gentleman wasn't obviously bound up or showed any visible signs of physical injury, but he was possibly one of those who'd had the dysentery or the paratyphoid, so she may have nursed him for 2 weeks, 3 weeks max, and struck up a connection, and obviously a deep connection. But he's been sent back, as the majority of them were, and he would have been killed on a battle in Gallipoli after returning. So that sadness, obviously, for her to talk about it very late in life, it was ingrained in her mentality. Yeah, my research indicates that Elma Linklater was the only Shire of Dardanup woman to serve as a nurse in the First World War.